Now it is feeding, and now it's the waiting game. Looks like it says we are live. Always take a minute. What do you see on your side, Vance?
Yep, we're on.
We are on. Awesome. Yeah, I've got a commercial.
All right.
Let's see. Let me make sure. Let me see, because I got to get into the chat room too. Oh, yes, there I am. There's my big mug. All right, we are definitely officially live. Welcome, everybody, to, well, as I like to say, and our guests will relate to, as he quotes it, welcome to the desert of the real. This is AB Live, episode 31, and truly honored to have, again, as always, a friend of the Gnostics and one of the few people I think gets the Gnostics, and that is Anthony Peake. How you doing, Anthony?
Miguel, it's absolutely fantastic to be back talking to you. Your dulcet tones don't change. All that tobacco and coffee is certainly working well with you.
Yeah, a little bit older, but here we are again, as they say, and it's a great honor, and always an honor. We've got Vance Sachi, the Moondog. How you doing, Vance?
Oh, I'm starting to wake up here. I'm very excited to have Anthony on here. One of my favorite subjects, all these other entities from other places.
Awesome. Good to have you here, as always. And yes, for the audience, we will be discussing Anthony's new book, The Hidden Universe, an investigation into non-human intelligences. As always, this show is live right now, but it will be available on YouTube afterwards, and I will have the audio version as well out in all of our channels, probably within 24 hours, iTunes, iHeartRadio, and Stitcher, and all those good podcast providers. For a bonus for AB Prime members and patrons at Patreon, I'm going to include the first 4 episodes of our old podcast that Anthony and I used to do, Schrodinger's Diary. So you'll get a bonus of like 2 hours where Anthony discusses his really engaging and impactful ideas on the daemon. Is there life after death? Of course, Philip K. Dick, and a whole bunch of other really great heresies. So definitely want to subscribe to that one if you can. So other than that, we'll get started. And of course, I will keep reminding people as they start going into the chat. As always, if you have a question for Vance, he will be using his eye in the sky surveillance system, Uber Daemon, for questions. So please, if you can, type in all caps or use many question marks. And when we get to the questions, Vance will feed them to Anthony. So other than that, Anthony, so tell us about the process of why you decided to write this book, a little bit of a pivot from your last 2 books.
Yeah, well, it's probably directly related to the previous 2 books, in that I was continually coming across people who have experienced altered states of consciousness, lucid dreaming, out of body states, entheogen encounters, dimethyltryptamine, ayahuasca, and various other things. And I was really interested to discover that there's an awful lot of books being written on these things, but nobody's really pursued, not for many years anyway, the true nature of the entities that people experience in these altered states of consciousness. And I was particularly intrigued by the mounting evidence that on many occasions, these entities seem to be independent of the person that's perceiving them. Now, what I mean by this is the idea that if we argue that this is something to do with our own subconscious and somehow we're building up, bringing these things out from deep within ourselves, the question is, where are they coming from? You know, particularly if there are cases whereby the entities that are encountered seem to contradict what the person involved wants to do. Now, I'll give an example of this. Somebody that will be listening in here is Dr. Carl Smith, who is a researcher into altered states of consciousness. He's an expert on virtual reality and everything else. And Carl, if you're there, thanks for listening in. And about a year ago or so, Carl, we were working on an event together. We did an event, we recreated Plato's cave in Draculo's caves in Kidderminster in the UK. And one of the things that Carl is doing is he's involved in a research project taking place at Imperial College in London. And this research project is people volunteering to take dimethyltryptamine intravenously, so they can then report back their experiences in altered states of consciousness. And the people, when people take DMT, they say they encounter what Terence McKenna called the machine elves, these entities, these little sprites, these little creatures that seem to be having fun with you. And Carl described to me how when he took the DMT, he found himself in the DMT cage, the DMT zone, and this entity comes over to him, looks him and eyeballs him and said, "You shouldn't be doing it this way. This is the wrong way of doing it. Please don't do it this way." He then comes back down into consensual reality, the Kenoma, as we'd like to call it, if we're using Gnostic terms here. And he comes back into the Kenoma from the Pleroma, and or in the liminal places between the Kenoma and the Pleroma. And he then, a week later or so, he then takes the substance again, finds himself in the same location, and the very same entity comes over and says, "I told you last time, you shouldn't be doing this way." Now, this to me was intriguing, because this is not what Carl wanted to hear. It's not what the researchers want to hear, but self-evidently, this is what the entity wanted to get across to him. So it stimulated me to think, well, come on, what's your next book going to be about? Now, I'd always been interested in the writings of people like Jacques Vallée, and other individuals, Project Trojan Horse by John Keel. These are books that are written on ufology, but they're writing ufology from a very different viewpoint. They're writing ufology from the idea that somehow these entities are internal to ourselves, and that they can be manifest under certain circumstances. And they're actually much closer related to our own psychology than we genuinely believe them to be. You know, they're not alien entities coming from the Pleiades or whatever else they're coming from, Epsilon Eridani or wherever. These creatures seem to be related to us, and they seem to have been around since year dot. But it was a series of events that took place with my own mother, when my mother one day reported to me that she said that she was seeing little creatures, little children that were singing to her. And before then, she'd had a very strange encounter with what I can only describe as being a grey, in a state of hypnagogia and in a state of sleep paralysis, where she described this creature in her bedroom coming round the door with huge black eyes, 2 holes for a nose and a slit for a mouth. And the creature looked at her and dodged back in the middle of the night. She then starts reporting she's seeing these little creatures around her. Now, I immediately was aware of what this could be. My writings, I've touched upon something called Charles Bonnet syndrome in the past. And to me, this was classic evidence of Charles Bonnet syndrome. But yet again, these creatures seem to be independent of my mother. And I then managed to get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's with my mother. So I decided I need to look into this more. There is something far more mysterious going on here than just the simple idea. And that is the book, The Hidden Universe. And that was the background and the motivations for writing it.
Yeah, it's wonderful. As I told you, I enjoyed a lot. It was a great read. And as what I've always admired about your work is like very much like Philip K. Dick or Carl Jung. You saw the sort of innovations that the Gnostics had in providing alternative models of reality 2,000 years ago, and how these models are still relevant today, how they hit upon something. And as you said, you start your book with the idea of the Kenoma and the Pleroma, with the Horus in between. And as you provide in your book, the Kenoma simply means emptiness. And like the Buddhists thousands of years ago, the Gnostics saw the universe as basically nothingness, which science has supported today.
Oh, absolutely. And this is the thing that all through my writing, and you'll know this probably more than anybody else, is that my writing has always had this dichotomy, this dynamic, this I don't know a dialectic, I suppose, if we want to put sort of Marxist analysis on it. The dialectic of the idea that we can do the science and we can look into the science, and I will always make my starting point the science. because as Marcello Trui once said, you know, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And I tend to try to do the science as best I can before I start going off into the strangeness. But all through my writing, there's also this fascination with Gnosticism, the fascination that this reality, whatever it may be, seems to be in some way false. Either it's a facsimile or it's a recreation of something else. I'm these days wary of using the term simulation because the word simulation implies that it is a copy of something else. But I think it's far more embedded than that. And the Gnostics, you know, in the 1st century AD, and if you take back Gnosticism to its roots and you take it back to Greek philosophy and the pre-Socratics and the writings of Plato and the idea of Plato's cave and the analogy of Plato's cave, clearly there is something of deep significance here that only these days are we starting to really appreciate, because it is only in the last 20 years or so that we have been able to recreate virtual realities, computer simulation, virtual realities that are nearly as believable as this. Now, you know, I play with virtual reality quite a lot, you know, I have a virtual reality headset and everything. And it always amazes me how believable these worlds are. And when you spend time in them, you sometimes take time to acclimatize back into this world. Now, interestingly enough, only yesterday, I was speaking to a lady who is the lady behind Contact in the Desert, the big event in California that I was supposed to be speaking at this summer. And she'd not come across Second Life before. So I took her over to Second Life and showed her what Second Life was about. And there was this sudden realization of suddenly, my word, there are worlds within worlds here that you can exist within. And of course, that's what the Gnostics said. They said that this is a creation of Yaldabaoth. This is the fullness, is the reality behind this reality. The Pleroma is the real reality, the place of Plato's forms, if we want to use another term for this. And this is a simulation that we are within. And the entities, I think, are part of this simulation or part of another simulation that can break through into this one. And this is where I go with the book. So you can take the book on 2 levels. You can take it on the esoteric, mystical side of the book, which I'm quite happy to go to, but I also do the science as well. And I think I'm one of the few writers that's doing this or trying to do this and trying to bridge the gaps between.
Oh yeah, I mean it's great that you're mixing in myth, science, sound science studies, scientific studies, and all that, and do a great job. It's not that long of a read, but it's so packed with gnosis, as I like to say. It's reality bending, I'd like to say. And for the audience, I see now you're beginning to really pack it in the chat room. So again, if you have a question, please write it in caps or put many question marks. We will try to get to them to the best of our ability. I think you were talking about Second Life. Vince, you like to play Second Life too.
Yeah, a while ago, I like all that virtual reality stuff. There was a thing called Active Worlds years ago that I did a lot of work in.
Good deal, good deal. So Anthony, I think one of your central ideas, and I loved it, and you, as you say, you lean on the work of Mark Stavish on his great book Egregores, and he was a past guest in this book, and I think it's a game changer because it really it's a completely different paradigm than how we're used to dealing with the other or metaphysical entities. As Mark writes, and you quote, an egregore is an occult, autonomous psychic entity composed of and influencing the thoughts of a group of people. So maybe you could expand a little bit more on your idea and your own innovation, which you call the egregorial.
Yeah, it's that Mark and I have chatted on quite a few occasions. I'm a huge admirer of Mark. Not only his book on egregores, but also his book on lucid dreaming and out-of-body experiences. He is a fascinating guy. And funnily enough, I'm working with a small group of individuals at the moment in terms of writing a series of academic papers. And in one of our chats yesterday or the day before, we were discussing contacting Mark and involving him in some way in the work we're doing, because we think he's of such profound importance in all this. But what I'm interested in is, can the human mind create the egregores? And I use two terms. I use egregore and egregorial. And I make a subtle difference here. As Mark would argue, an egregore is something that any group of individuals, when they are together and they share certain ideals, certain thoughts and everything else, it seems that they create something bigger than themselves. There seems to be an additional something that comes within the group. Now, in this, I'm reminded of the research in the late 19th century by a French sociologist called Le Bon, who wrote a fascinating book on the mass psychology of crowds and the idea of how when a crowd of people get together, there seems to be something that is created greater than them. And as Mark Stavish would argue, you know, that things such as National Socialism, Nazism, fascism, all these things all become greater as a force for good or a force for evil. But I'm more interested in the smaller aspects of this. Can a small group of people create something greater than themselves, which has independence of them? Now, myself and a young anthropologist called Samantha Treasure and an engineer, an engineering graduate called Mariam Abadi, were thinking of recreating something that took place back in 1972 called the Toronto experiment, where a group of researchers created an entity, a ghost, for want of a better term, called Philip, whereby they gave this Philip character a history, a background, and a life almost, whereby they gave him a background story that he was a Catholic aristocrat living in the 17th century. He fell in love with a girl. He was hurt in love and everything else as well. And then after creating this, they then managed to manifest this entity using a Ouija board. Now, it seems that the entity had taken control almost, that it had pulled itself away and had become something more real. Now, for me, this is intriguing because if you read the work of Alexander David Neal, who was a Belgian lady, French-Belgian lady, who in the turn of the century to the 1920s took herself off to Tibet. Her husband was wealthy and they had this open relationship. So she goes off to Tibet and he pays all her money and she has all this fantastic time in Tibet. And while she was there, she became fascinated by Tibetan magic, which of course I am, because I'm fascinated by the Bon tradition about dream yoga, how they work. But she worked with this and created what is known as a tulpa. And a tulpa is a thought form that has independence of people. And she created her little group. They created a tiny little Buddhist monk. And it was manifest in three-dimensional pleromic in the kenomic reality external to ourselves. And this creature manifested itself and initially was at their will. It was at their beck and call. It did what they expected it to do because they were creating it. But then it started to develop an independence of itself. And it started to get malevolent and started to be far more nasty. And in the end, they had to literally exorcise it from themselves. Now, again, one of my friends that sadly died about 18 months ago is a very famous British theatre producer called Graham Murray. And Graham became a very good friend of mine after reading a couple of my books. And we were working together on getting a play by J.B. Priestley produced, but that's an aside story now. But Graham explains in one of his books, anything that can happen, anything that can go wrong will go wrong, which is a wonderful read, by the way. If you get the opportunity to read this, he knows everybody. He knows everybody in the theatrical world. You know, it's just incredible. I don't think there's anybody he didn't know. But effectively in this, he describes at one time when he had been asked to bring this to meet this guy who was a Danish aristocrat and somebody who was known in occult circles. And this guy comes over and he's staying in Graham's flat, and a guy called Arnold Hernigstad. And while they were there, they got discussing about the idea of the nature of evil, the nature of the beast. And they were particularly talking about the beast in the fairy stories. And Arnold turns around, he said, the beast still exists. It is here. And he pointed at a chair opposite them. And Graham describes in the book, and he described it to me, and he said, suddenly this creature appears in the chair and it's manifest. And he said it looked like the Gorgon. It had it had snakes for hair, and it leered at him, looked at him, and leered at him, and then started to shapeshift really rapidly, and then disappeared. Now, as Braham said to me, he said that was real. He said it had to be real because it not only was an hallucination in consensual reality that I saw, but it was created by somebody else and manifested in my mind. Now, he said he could have hypnotized me, but even if he did, he still created an hallucination that seemed to have independence of both of us. Now, again, I'm fascinated by hallucinations. In the book, I have a section on hallucinations, particularly because there were two hallucinations taking place there. There was the hallucination of what Braham saw, but there was also the hallucination of taking out the image of the chair. Because remember, when you see an hallucination like that, you not only see the hallucination, but the hallucination obscures your field of vision. So you cannot see part of reality in order to accommodate the hallucination. Now, again, Braham said this being was independent. So again, did we have an egregore being created here that was both created by Arnold Herningstadt, was perceived by Braham, but was also there in reality? Now, from this, I then became intrigued about the true nature of what this means. Now, I drilled right back into, and I was particularly interested in the writings of the Gospel of the Book of Enoch, and the way in which the Book of Enoch, which we know this is very much within the whole remit of Gnosticism, how the Book of Enoch describes how the Watchers appeared from down on Mount Hermon, and how they were these entities that came from somewhere else. And of course, the word watcher is, and you look at it in the Greek, it's egregor, it's egregorial. So again, we have these, and of course, what is more intriguing here is the Book of Enoch is an apocryphal gospel. It didn't actually get into our gospels, but it is part of the Gnostic tradition, and indeed it is gospel within the Eritrean church and within the Ethiopian church. And if you look at this, how it came through, you then get this whole stream of Enochian magic, and how Enochian magic comes through, and you get Enochian magic happening in terms of the writings and the work of Dr. D, and the work he did with Kelly, and how he was manifesting entities, Uriel and various other individuals, which then carries straight through to the work of Aleister Crowley and Crowley's creations of Lamb, and his creation of his holy higher angel, as he called it. You know, what does this mean? It seems that this has been known for an awful long time, but it's been hidden. It has been literally occulted. It's been hidden away. And what I'm saying is, it's time now that we start thinking about these things scientifically, because we know in quantum physics that the act of observation or the act of measurement collapses a waveform, which is a wave of potentiality, into an actuality, into a point particle. So could it be that by the act of observation, we can bring into this into the Kenoma entities that need us to exist? And in this, I'm reminded of the work of Paul Eno, who is an American paranormal researcher. And he has a name for these entities. He calls them the parasites. And I'm reminded here, and then I tend to go off on these tangents of ideas. But if you then start looking into the Islamic tradition and the Islamic tradition of the jinn, we then find something very interesting, because if you read the Quran and you read the other doctrines, particularly the areas of the Sufis, and of course we know the Sufis are Gnostic, just like the Kabbalists were Gnostic and like the Gnostics were Gnostic. And what do the Sufis say? They say that the jinn are created out of smokeless fire. Smokeless fire, what can that be? Well, it could be plasma. And this is exactly what various writers are saying, you know, here, that plasma is another form of energy. It's another form of matter. And could this be what smokeless fire is? Because the jinn seem to have very similar elements of these entities that come through. In the book, I have large sections on the writings of Henri Corbin, the French Sufi writer. And some of his work, you read Corbin and you read his work and Surabindi and the writings he did about the true nature of reality. And suddenly you go, my God, the Sufis have got it. The Sufis had it, man. You know, really, they had the area of the area of overlap between the Pleroma and the Kenoma, how this.
Looks like we lost Anthony. Are you there, Vance?
Yeah,
Are
I'm
you
here.
frozen? Okay.
Yeah, here he comes. I think
All
he'll be
right.
back.
Okay.
Anthony,
You there,
I can't know if you
Anthony?
can hear us. Yeah, we lost you for a second.
The Archons have struck. Anthony got too close to the truth.
No, I was doing a show very recently with how it went, and they said it's never happened before, and it started to talk about these things. We discuss the Archons in a kind of jokey way, but it happens far too often. Miguel and I used to do the show regularly. It was a running joke. It really was a running joke.
Every time.
And my other producer produces my show as well, Dia Nunez. Dia and I do our regular show, and we also have now the Archons. We wait for the Archon attacks. You know, it just seems to happen. It's more than coincidence. But
Yeah.
it's a little bit about the background of where we're going with. Now, myself and Sam Treasure, on the other hand, we're also taking the route of a term you used before, the Uberdaemon. The idea of the way in which we can bring in alternate versions of ourselves to this reality. The concept is again completely Gnostic, but there's the Uberdaemon, and then there's the Codemon, something I'm thinking about now, which is the Jungian, and we can bring that in as well. I'm still, by the way, looking as if I've gone.
Yeah, it says here your network bandwidth is low. If it continues, you might just have to turn off your video and do audio. That usually fixes things. So we'll play it by ear. But yes, the Archons had to decide to make an appearance because Anthony Peake's in the house. It is what it is. But yeah, your book, after I finished your book, I was like looking around and you get that feeling, man, reality is not reality. And it is a busy universe out there. And I wanted to share a story with you, Anthony, before we get to audience questions. Years ago, before I even knew of egregores, I used to do ghost hunting here in Chicago. And I would go to like places where like Al Capone had his offices deep and underneath sky.
You went there?
Yes. And
was Geraldo there? Remember that?
Exactly. No, we didn't go there. It was office, but we take our divining rods and all our equipment, and we get a group of people, and they'd pay us, and we go under there. And then we do these again with the divining rod. We'd see the temperature go down, which means that the entities were taking energy. And we'd ask somebody, would get a feeling like, oh, my grandmother's here. And I did this every day. I mean, it was normal. And with the divining rod, I'd ask a question that only your grandmother would know. And we'd get it right. And they'd have these conversations with their grandmother or friend or whatever it is. And I would be thinking, even before I knew it, I said, this is suspicious. I don't think your grandmother is talking from heaven or the other way. I have a feeling that we've all drawn our energy and belief, and that one person picked up all this electromagnetic energy, and this person now knows, and basically we've created an entity that it's alive, it's independent, or it's around us. And night after night, we were creating egregores deep under in these basements in the dark. So I certainly saw it for factual truth. But Anthony, we were creating egregores, these thought forms. But isn't that a little bit different than an egregorial? Because I think an egregorial is still independent, although we perhaps give it our cultural surrounding, our energy, so that it can become independent and interactive with us. Is that the difference, Anthony?
Yeah, in effect. And one of the things that Mariam and Sam and myself are wanting to do is to see if we can prove this under controlled conditions as to whether collective thoughts can manifest independence. Now, this means in effect that the the relationship between us and them, whatever they are, is far more intertwined than we'd hitherto believe. And I think that the whole egregorial model works as a superb explanator of your experiences. For instance, when you were talking there, I'm thinking poltergeist activity. You know, poltergeist activity seems to be created usually by a younger person that's involved. We then have dissociative personality syndrome, where people's personalities seem to split as if they create alternate personalities. But also the way in which cultural things become independent of ourselves as well. I'm reminded, for instance, and it's one of the things I've never mentioned this before, I don't think, in interviews before, but one of the things that really intrigues me is in quantum physics, how it is that if you look at the history of quantum physics, the amount of times that a group of scientists had an almost desperation said there should be a subatomic particle here, and they find it. For instance, there was a classic case. There's a very famous quantum physicist called E. Rabi, and when they were trying to find the muon, they were failing. But they were thinking about it, and then one day the muon just appears, and Rabi jokingly said, "Who ordered that?" You know, the idea is as if quantum physics, what is happening is we are creating quantum physics as we go along. And is that why quantum physics has got so bizarre now? That what is happening is we are thinking, well, what's the solution to mass within things? Oh, it's the Higgs boson. So we collectively all think about the Higgs boson, and suddenly the Higgs boson comes into existence. But we know that these subatomic particles come from the quantum phone. They just come up for a billionth of a second and go back again. It's as if they're being drawn into this reality by our collective consciousness in some way. And of course, this is what Jung would argue. And of course, we know that Jung was incredibly Gnostic in his worldview. And it's the idea that we are far more, our minds are far more powerful than we believe. You know, there is no duality. There is only mind. There is only consciousness. And consciousness creates the external reality we perceive by the act of perception. Now, this is not, I'm not trying to be non-scientific here, but the evidence is powerful. Again, going back to the fact, all subatomic particles, before they are measured or seen, are literally a statistical wave whereby that subatomic particle will be found in one location or the other. This is proven time and time again by something called the twin slit experiment. It is proven within the twin slit experiment that if subatomic particles are observed or watched, they are point particles. If they are not observed or watched, they are waves of probability. This isn't wacky stuff. This is the real deal, you know. And what we need to do is to start bringing the occult factors into this and saying, well, what have the Gnostics been telling us? What have the occult people been telling us? And what is science telling us? But at the moment, everybody's in their silos. Nobody's talking to each other because they're too scared. Because they're too scared to talk to each other because tenure, academic tenure, they can't talk about these kind of things anymore. And it drives me crazy. And it means I'm in the middle of a bridge and people on both sides are lobbing stones at me. So I'm going, oh, well, fair enough. I'll be right in the end.
Yes, you will be, and you are right now. And unfortunately, yeah, when you get into these liminal positions, you will get demonized, as so many others have. So, but Vance, do you have a question for Anthony, or anybody in any questions from the chat you would like to share?
Yeah, we got a couple of questions. I've got one, Anthony. Dream worlds and dreams. That's another example of a phenomenon in consciousness where you can see brand new people you've never seen before, brand new places and so forth. And so I wonder what the relationship of dreams is to egregores, egregorials, and so forth.
Yeah. Dreams, to me, dreams are part of the egregorial in the same way that egregores, as individuated parts of the egregorial, are manifest. I work closely with a lot of people who lucid dream and people who have out of the body experiences. And I've got case after case of lucid dreamers who have had experiences whereby they have met somebody in a lucid dream state and then subsequently met them in consensual reality. Case after the case. This is not unusual. It is similar when people go into dream states, particularly lucid dreamers who can control to a degree their dream state, can go back to the same place and will explore that place in exactly the same way as a lucid dreamer does. Now, again, I was on Second Life earlier this week, with a lucid dreamer who regularly lucid dreams. And her comments were quite precise. She said, this is just like a lucid dream. It is so similar. So clearly it is a created, fabricated world that you are fabricating. And of course, Jung would argue this. Jung would argue that you can create from the darkness of your subconscious these places that we visit. And now, dreams are fascinating. Lucid dreams are fascinating. Out-of-body experiences, what's the similarity or differences between out-of-body experiences and lucid dreaming? What's the differences with remote viewing? Are they all part of the same continuum? I believe they are. I believe they are elements of the deeper and deeper realities that you drill within. And this is another area of my inquiry, and it is so exciting. So Vance, that was a superb question. Really, really good.
Oh, thanks. We got lots of other questions here. Dragoron wants to know if you've heard of Stuart Hameroff and his work on microtubules and effects with DMT.
Yeah, Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose, the orchestrated objective reduction. Yes, in fact, I had a long chat with Stuart Hameroff about 3 years ago in London about the similarities between his model and my own. I've been fascinated by the implications of OR, and I've written about it extensively, specifically in my book, The Infinite Minefield and Opening the Doors of Perception, because Hameroff is arguing that, or Hameroff and Penrose argue that within the structures of the brain, indeed within the structures of the neurons themselves, are tiny, tiny little things of tubulin called microtubules. And these microtubules are so small, and they give off light. They give off minute pulses of light, which means they can create interference patterns. On top of that, they are so small that quantum effects have effects with them. So this is an interface between the quantum world and our life of thought. So if the microtubules are interfacing with a deeper level of reality, is this where consciousness comes in? And this is what Hameroff argues, because Hameroff is professor of anesthesiology at the University of, I think, Arizona. And Penrose was the Rouse Ball professor of maths at the University of Cambridge. The two of them are very, very intelligent guys. And Hameroff has been fascinated as to what happens when individuals take an anesthetic, because consciousness and awareness doesn't just, it disappears, it goes somewhere else, it's switched off. And he believes this is because our interface with the greater reality, what one would argue is the 0 point field of information, gets switched off. And we cease to be, we cease to function. Now, I've taken that much further, and it's sad that Stuart didn't come back to me, because I've now taken this into the areas of Alzheimer's. Because when individuals get Alzheimer's, what happens is things called amyloid plaques destroy the tubulin structures within the neurons. So it is literally the amyloid plaques with somebody with Alzheimer's, their communication channels with the inner reality are being destroyed. And this is why they start to lose they start to fade away. It's not because they're dying, it's because it's like a radio receiver and the valves are being destroyed. And because the valves are being destroyed, you can no longer pick up the radio waves. But I think what is more intriguing here is my research tells me that these individuals, when they start to come into Alzheimer's, they start to see egregorials all over the place. They start to see them through Charles Bonnet syndrome. Charles Bonnet syndrome manifests as it did with my mother, and suddenly they're seeing these creatures. In the book, I have a whole section on this. But what is even more intriguing is I can then extrapolate that to children. Because children, when they have autism, they see creatures, they see things that other people don't see. And why is this? Simple. It's because the neurons of the brain are not myelinated. Myelination, which is the insulation on the neurons, only starts when the child gets to 5, 6, or 7. And on top of that, the corpus callosum, which is the muscular body that holds together the two type sides of the brain, also is not fully developed. So at the beginning of life and at the end of life, you start to perceive the egregorial far greater. And this is one of the central theses of the book. We need to pursue this more. We need to be looking into these in greater detail and listen to what these people are telling us. There's a friend of mine, Maggie Latourell, who's written a book called The Gift of Alzheimer's, which is a narrative of her mother's decline into Alzheimer's. The things that Maggie's mother was perceiving and seeing, she became telepathic. She was having out of the body experiences. She was seeing entities all the time. She was aware of what Maggie was thinking. You know, this is unbelievable. And Hammerhoff and Penrose, I know I'm a nobody. I know I'm just this nobody guy that's, you know, that's got, you know, that's just nobody. They need to listen to me, not because I'm important, but I really am joining the dots here. You know, stop being siloed, stop pretending that you don't want to talk to people about other things, because it's only by talking to people that we really will proceed. Off my soapbox.
Well, you're not a nobody to us, that's for sure. One of my favorite guests. I love this type of thing, as Miguel knows. We had another question here. Oh, about Ouija boards, and what can you say about Ouija boards and the entities that seem to come? You know, when a group of people get around the board, is there a distinction between a board spirit or an egregore, or how does that interact?
I think, I don't know yet, but this is the work that Mariam and myself and Sam is going to be doing, is to try and find out exactly what these entities are. Now, there is an argument to say in a Ouija board, there's the argument to say that it's kind of subliminal muscular movements. And that's why you move, because you're subliminally doing it. When I was a kid and we used to play Ouija, you know, sometimes you'd think that a friend was pushing it, but sometimes you did get strange effects that you cannot describe. It was as if, again, the collective group, because everybody's thinking collectively again. You know, it's unusual for a group of people to just concentrate on their fingers placed on the top of a glass. It's unusual to have that kind of focus of intention. And I think that's when the glass starts to move. And that's when the waveform, if I want to use the quantum physics analogy, the waveform of the egregore, the statistical waveform of the egregore gets reduced down by the active concentration of a group of people into a particle, which it then can grow and manifest. Now, again, this is a powerful tool for understanding how these work, because again, the reminder of the Philip experiment in 1972 shows that this can be done. Now, it's the question of, where does the information come from, though? Because when these entities manifest, they seem to again have independence of us in one way or another. They seem to have independent motivations of us. Is it because we are drawing up information from the 0 point field, from the Akashic field? I wrote a book a few years ago with Professor Irvin Laszlo on this, and the idea that the Akashic field is an information field. It's to do with 0 point energy, and I haven't got time to go into the physics of this, but the latest research is suggesting that information itself is physical. If information is physical, it means it has physical reality in three-dimensional space. It then means that our model that the universe is made up of information, or as David Bohm would say, information, Professor David Bohm. If it's information, this literally means it's informed, it's informing itself, and it's bringing up information from fields of information that we have access to do when we're in altered states of consciousness. And these fields of information bring themselves in and carry with them information from elsewhere. Now, this is maybe how past life regression takes place. We attune into the collective unconsciousness of mankind, and in doing so, draw up the information and create a story based upon what was a real story of somebody else's life. You know, this model is very, very powerful. It is powerful. It is a powerful explanator of so many experiences.
Wow, great stuff. Vince, do you have more questions? Because I know you have a lot of passion about this intersection of science and mysticism. So, or from the audience, this is a lot of fun.
I know it. I love the subject. Someone thinks Anthony gives channelers a hard time in the chat room here. And
Yeah,
so he's wondering why you do that if we're all one mind, if we all belong to this mind.
Right. channelers are interesting. If you listen to one channeler and the entity they channel, that entity never ever mentions the other entities that other people are channeling. Have you noticed it's only my channeled entity that is the one that has access to everything? Give me your money and I'll access all this information for you from my entity. But if one of those entities comes back and says, while I was in that state, I came across Joe Bloggs' entity over here and Fred's entity over here, but that never ever happens. All they want to do is take your money from you. But if these guys were giving it for free, and of course their argument is, well, no, we've got to live. Well, yeah, sure you have. But if one of these entities came out with one bit of information that was useful, just anything that's useful rather than philosophy and waffle, you know, how many of these entities said that COVID-19 was going to happen?
Or how to
I rest my case. I rest my case. You know, come on. If they know things that we don't know, they should be able to tell us. They should be able to turn around and say, there's a subatomic particle you haven't discovered, and then we find it. If they're from the Pleiades and the ascended masters and, you know, 7,000-year-old Atlantean princes, they should have information we don't know, but they don't. They just waffle the same crap.
Just like television channels.
Yeah. Do I believe that we can attune into greater informational fields? Yes, I do. Do I believe that all these people are charlatans? No, I don't. They genuinely believe. But these entities really need to come up and give us something solid rather than just nonsense. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not drawing up information, but to me, there are too many of these charlatans out there who are destroying it for serious people who are doing serious academic research in this. And every time one of these people come up and make these nonsensical statements, the skeptics love it. They absolutely love it, and they tar all of us with this brush, and it drives me crazy. You know, they've got to stop it. Just stop it, for God's sake. You know, let us do proper research. If you can channel these entities, like for instance, if you can get out of your body automatically and you can go around the corner and bring back information, that's great. Do it in laboratory conditions to prove it. Nobody's ever done that. Nobody ever does. They all claim they can do it, but then something happens when they can't do it under laboratory conditions. Do I believe these things happen? Yes. Do I believe they can do it automatically? No. I have people I know who have profound out-of-body experiences that are veridical and they bring back information, but they will readily admit they can't do it just like that. Just like good mediums. I believe there are mediums out there, and I think some of them are excellent. The good mediums can't control it to the extent that the stage mediums who just stand there and do it and get paid for it. You know, that's my opinion. That's my opinion.
Oh, very good. Miguel, we have, you want to do more questions? I think
Yes,
we got a couple
please
other ones.
do. Yes.
Well, I got a couple of questions. Well, have you heard of this author? Have you heard of that author? Anthony, are you interested in those kind of questions?
Yeah, no, fine.
Okay. Let's see. Williamson's Bainbridge. You ever hear of that guy?
Name rings a bell, but that's as far as it goes.
Okay. Vincent Bridges or Dan Winters, Exploring
Nope.
Quantum Physics within Enochian Magic?
No, but that would be very interesting to look at the angle on that. That could be quite an interesting point. If anybody wants to contact me on Facebook or Instagram with some suggestions on this, that's really great. You know, and if these guys are willing to want to work with me, that's even better. You know, it'd be really, really superb. Just like my thing just before, if there are people out there that can get out of your body at will, and you can go into a next room, bring back a 6-digit number and come back, I want to hear from you, because that will prove it. You know, I'm not dissing you guys. All I'm saying is, as Truey said, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And if we can prove this, we'll blow up. We're into a new paradigm.
How about sleep paralysis? Someone had a question about that.
Sleep paralysis, or AKA REM intrusion. What happens in sleep paralysis? It's a very, very fascinating phenomenon. What takes place is that when we are sleeping, we enact our dream, we move around and enact our dreams. That could be very dangerous. Damage ourselves, or we could damage somebody who's sleeping. What the body does is it brings about a form of paralysis whereby you cannot move. Now, sometimes people will become semi-awake in these circumstances. And when they do, They feel they cannot move. They have a sensation that somebody's sitting on their chest. They just feel trapped.
Yeah.
But what is intriguing in this is that throughout history, people describe the same entity. It's called the hag. You will see either an old woman or a person in a cowl wearing like a monk. And it will normally be in profile. It will normally be in the corner of the bedroom, or it will look at you. Now, what I think is taking place here is that rather like we were discussing liminal states between wake and sleep, in my book, The Out of Body Experience, I discuss this as well. It's you are experiencing almost the pleroma, or the area between the locations, in a state that's called hypnagogic imagery. Now, hypnagogic imagery is when it takes place as you're dropping off to sleep, and when you're waking up, it's called hypnagogic imagery. Now, when you are in these states, this is when the out of body experience takes place. It's when lucid dreaming takes place, and people can train themselves to stay in these states. I mean, I'm working with a couple of Austrian researchers, Dr. Engelbert Winkler and Dr. Dirk Prokol, who have invented a machine called the hypnagogic light experience. And this machine puts people into these states automatically by using stroboscopic light and intensities of light. It is an incredibly powerful machine. Had we been at the event in California in the end of May, we were going to be bringing 2 or 3 of these machines with us to show people. What we're planning to do is recreate Plato's cave in Greece later on this year or spring of next year, in the cave that the academics believe that Plato placed the thing. And we're going to have these machines with us, together with some of the machines that Carl has got in terms of, and everything else as well. So we're going to try and do this, because what we want to do is to show to people how you can move into liminal states, and how it is that what we think is consensual reality is not quite what it seems. But sleep paralysis is fascinating, but also terrifying. Also something that has been experienced. It's across all cultures, and it's been forever in time. It's a genuine thing.
Yeah, very good. I think we're having some network troubles with the, can you still hear us, Anthony?
I can, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
we can
yeah,
hear you.
okay. Yeah, the video's frozen, but I can still hear you.
Your voice is coming through.
You know,
real quick, your friend Sam Treasure is in the chat. I told her if she wants a question or a comment to let us know. But
Oh, good.
so far,
Good,
nothing.
because-
But she's there. She made herself available.
Okay.
So, but Vince, keep it going.
yeah, you know, I always had the thought that, I want to say something else. In terms of the hag, I was in a seminar one time, and part of the seminar, everybody got together and looked at each other, and we were supposed to just look at the partner's face for a long time, just totally concentrate.
Oh, now the Archons have gotten Vance.
Have they got me still, or have you got
No,
me?
no, you're still coming clear. I guess.
Yeah, because this
That I had it. Am I coming through again?
Yeah, yes.
Oh,
You were
yes.
just, it got cut off. We were staring at people's faces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my partner was this gal I had a crush on for a long time, right? We weren't going out, but we were kind of like having near misses. She liked me, I liked her. But anyway, I sat there and we looked at each other's faces, and her face turned into the hag. It was so horrible, because I thought this gal was so cute and everything. To have somebody like that turn into a hag, what do you think happened there?
To me, there's an old technique called scrying, and scrying is looking into a mirror under certain circumstances and staring at your own face, or staring within the mist behind the mirror. And in doing so, you start to see things that are different. Now, again, this phenomenon is interesting. This staring at each other is something that intrigues me. It's something I desperately need to try, because I've also read that if you can actually stare at each other for a long time and then almost link a different level, you can then try lucid dreaming and try and see if you encounter each other in lucid dreaming. But your point here is a different one. There is, what's the term? It's a form of deja. It's not deja, I can't think what it's called now, but it's like deja vu, but it's seeing something that you always used to seeing in a different way. I can't think what the technical term is now. And you do it, if you stare at your own reflection, you start to notice things that you don't notice before. And I think what happened there was the overlay of the hag was quite interesting, as if you were kind of scrying something different. Now, again, I know, for instance, that Dr. D did this when he was applying areas of Enochian magic. He was doing scrying all the time. And I know that Kelly, his associate, was a known scryer. And this is what he was doing. And he was trying to bring the egregorial entities in to discover. There was a book, I think the Book of Sogon, I think they wanted to translate, or they wanted to understand. And they brought through the entities like Uriel and everybody else. And then they developed the Enochian magic, the Enochian alphabet, which then became the basis of the work that Aleister Crowley did at Boleskine Manor. And when he was down at Thelema, down in Cefalo, down in Sicily, they were able to reproduce these things. And it's to do with stirring. And it's to do with just staring at anything, like the psychomantium, which the ancient Greeks used to use, which, again, myself and Marianne were talking about yesterday. Creating the psychomantium. I know that Moody, the near-death experience writer, he's been working with the psychomantium for some time as well. And that's looking, and again, it's looking into water and things, and looking into a water surface. It's the same principle as when people look into a crystal ball. It's as if the mind starts to go into another level of perception. And in doing so, they see through this reality into the reality behind the reality. I'm not saying they're seeing the Pleroma, but they are seeing the overlap areas. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, multiple realities too. You know, all these. And I sometimes I wonder, all these different channels. They say all these different things, and they have this different cast of people they talk about. Maybe this has something to do with the multiverse. You know, maybe there's so many different realities overlaid on top of ours or through ours that everybody is right in their own particular section.
Well, this again is something that has intrigued me a long time, as to why certain religious groups tenaciously have their own belief systems. And I would argue it's because everything that's in their world reinforces that belief, because they egregorially create the environment whereby what they believe becomes true. Now, again, this is a known phenomenon in sociology. There's something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which states that your language molds the way you perceive reality. And again, in the movie Arrival, that was one of the central themes. I was delighted in the movie Arrival, because it's the only time I've ever seen the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis actually mentioned in a movie, because I'd known about it. I studied the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis when I was at university way back in the early to mid 70s. So it's the idea that we can collectively mold our reality to our own expectations. So when people see UFOs, is it because they're molding their reality to see UFOs? Does it mean they're hallucinating? No, it doesn't. For instance, we know that thousands of people saw the sun spin in the sky at Fatima in Portugal in 1916 or whatever it was, 1914. Clearly, this was a collective hallucination, but it was real, because effectively, if thousands of people see the same thing, what does that say about consensual reality? Because the only reason we believe reality is standard is because we all agree we're seeing the same thing.
Right.
If we all see the same thing, that it's an hallucination. Now, is this then the power of the mind, and how the mind really can create things? And again, in quantum physics, again, many worlds interpretation of Hugh Everett III, his 1957 PhD thesis, trying to explain Schrodinger's cat and try over the fact, this is interesting, Hugh Everett wrote this in order to get over the Copenhagen interpretation of Max Born and Niels Bohr, who suggested there was a direct relationship between observation and reality, and the consciousness had a direct relationship. In order to get over that, they created the many worlds interpretation. But the counter argument here is that the latest work that Stephen Hawking did before he died, he came up with something called the top-down hypothesis of quantum physics with a guy called Frank Hartle of CERN. And in this top-down hypothesis, they argue that the outcome of every decision that we all make is already encoded in an informational field out there. every decision we make collapses the wave function to accommodate that decision. So it's all there in anticipation of a decision that's made by a conscious being, an unconscious being, who knows? But it means then that we all follow very different paths through the maze, very different paths, which accommodate our own expectations. And is this a much more sophisticated model than the law of attraction? It's much more sophisticated than that, but there is an element of truth in that. And we carry this through. And we're creating this now. The group of us now, the people in the chat room, the people who are involved in the 10,000 people that are involved in my on Facebook, we are creating this and we're carrying it through. My little group, when we meet, we say this all the time. It is just amazing, the energy that we can create. And I think we're tipping on the edge of something so profoundly important here. Really, really important.
Awesome.
Yeah, I
and
agree.
Wonderful. Anthony, I know we've done an hour. Do you need to jump off, or can you hang a little bit longer?
I could do another half an hour probably.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, because the chat room is bustling. There's like 100 people, and they're very curious. I guess what I'd like to ask you is, going back to the book, and some of the central ideas is that of shamanism, and you give some excellent examples of shamanistic journeys in Australia, in the United States, and all that. And I love your concepts of dismembering, which of course then comes down to the idea of Osiris. He's the great, of course, symbol of going to the other side and coming back from the other side. And of course, you talk about the Gnostics. We both know that the Gnostics were Neo-Pythagoreans, and all the rituals had to do with altered states of consciousness, ecstatics, and basically leaving the body or breaking down reality. The Gnostics were as shamanistic as they come for those Greco-Roman early Christian days. So maybe tell the audience a little bit about what you found with the shamans and how that plays into your research.
Yeah, shamanism is intriguing in that there seems to be a distinct relationship between shamanistic training and probably training the pineal gland in darkness to synthesize from melatonin endogenous, that's internally generated dimethyltryptamine. And I think this is why a lot of shamanic training involves people going into caves, into darkness and everything else. For instance, there is a group of shamans in northern Colombia, and the children are picked up as being potential shamans because of their behaviors. And I would argue the behaviors normally is because they're showing symptoms of either temporal lobe epilepsy, schizophrenia, or migraine, which again, in my previous books, I have something called the Huxleyan spectrum that explains how this works. It's all opening the doors of perception. So these children are seen to be susceptible to this. So they place them in darkness for the first 8 or 9 years of their lives. The reason they're placed in darkness is it trains the pineal gland to act in a different way. And the pineal gland, as you probably know, has all the elements of an eye. In fact, there is a lizard called the tutora, which exists on an island off New Zealand, that actually has a third eye in the center of its head. The third eye itself has, for instance, it has crystals in there. It's light sensitive. And it's light sensitive for a very good reason, because it sits above what's called the optic chiasma, which is the optic nerves from each eye when they run back to the visual cortex at the back of the brain. It crosses, and where it crosses, the pineal gland sits directly above that. And the reason the pineal gland sits directly above it is it's sensitive to the fact that activity is taking place within the optic nerves. And in doing so, it realizes that outside it's light, so it doesn't release melatonin, because melatonin is the substance, the enzyme that makes you go to sleep. When it starts to go dark, that's what it does. But sometimes it seems to be able to create other things. It seems to be, like, for instance, it's very intriguing, the pineal gland. The pineal gland has more blood going through it than any other organ in the body other than the liver. Why is that? What is it about this tiny little non-divided structure in the brain that demands that amount of blood? The other thing about the pineal gland is it's one of the few structures in the brain that is not the other side of the blood-brain barrier, which means it can get information from the rest of the body. There's something curious about it. And I argue that what it does is it creates dimethyltryptamine. when shamans are then trained, the dimethyltryptamine then puts them into altered states of consciousness and allows them to shamanic travel. And they shamanic travel into either the upper world, the middle world, or the lower world. Now, these worlds, again, rather similar to my model, are worlds that abut each other. There's a liminal places where people can go from one to the other. If you look at the legends of shamanism, there is, as Miguel said very, very strongly, there is this rule of dismemberment. It's the idea that when you go into the shamanic world, you are torn apart by entities, by creatures. They tear you to pieces, and then they reassemble you again as a new being. Now, I don't know if he's listening in here. It'd be delightful if he was. There's a gentleman called Myron Dial, who I feature in many of my books. He's an amazing artist based in Los Angeles. Myron has encountered temporal lobe epilepsy for most of his life. Myron has a one-to-one relationship with his own daemon. It was his daemon that first contacted me. His daemon is called Charon. And I have this model called the daemon eidolon dyad, which again goes back to Gnosticism, the idea we have a higher self, which is manifest in our lives, which is called the daemon. Then we have the eidolon, and the eidolon comes the word idol. And the eidolon is all of us that live within the simulation. But the daemon is our higher self, what the Enochian magicians would say, the magical Holy Spirit, what Aleister Crowley and Dee and everybody else were trying to contact within the magical tradition. It's to try and attune yourself to your own higher self. And in doing so, you then move outside of the Pleroma, out of the Kenoma, into the liminal areas and into the Pleroma. Now, again, in Gnostic belief systems, there is something called the shard of the Pleroma. And it's a part of the Pleroma that is embedded within inside us. It's something deep within inside us. And it's always screaming to go home to the Pleroma. That is an analogy to your daemon. Again, there is a wonderful, the hymn to the pearl, which is again one of the Gnostic texts. And in this, it tells about a man who goes to Egypt, and he goes away and he meets his own twin. This is again analogous to the idea that we are all twin beings. Now, Myron then has these experiences, and one of his experiences is extraordinary, where he is dismembered. And I describe this in the book, and he describes it in his own book called The Boy Nobody Wanted. And please get onto Myron's website, download this book. It is extraordinary. And again, Myron was going to be meeting me at the event in California. We're doing it again, hopefully next year. And Myron, hopefully, if he's okay, will be there with me next year to talk through his experiences. But it's to do with dismemberment. As you say, Osiris, the splitting up of Osiris. You know, the fact that the one bit of Osiris that got missing, which we won't go into, which people have been searching for forever. It's intriguing. And it's again, all these traditions all have the same belief systems inside them. You know, as Aldous Huxley said, it's the perennial philosophy. The perennial philosophy is Gnosticism. You know, this is what it's all about. Another round.
Yes, we actually had we did a Schrodinger's diary on with Myron one time. I put it up on YouTube, and then they struck it down because YouTube is so crazy. I mean, you just never know with YouTube. They once struck down my interview with Gary Lachman on Hermes Trismegistos. It's bizarre. You never know when these algorithms are gonna take you out.
I've recently interviewed Myron on a couple of occasions, and if anybody, did you go onto my website, anthonypeake.com, go into the section on Consciousness Hour, you'll find a couple of interviews with Myron there, or just look it up on YouTube. It's up on YouTube as well. My producer there, Dia Nunez, has something called the H2O Network, and all my old shows are there as well. Dia and Miguel, you know, are two people that I've worked with for an awful long time.
Yeah, it's a great shows. I definitely highly recommend them. Been years of a lot of good wisdom. And what I wanted to ask you next, Anthony, is the idea of the owl. And of course, you talk about why is the owl such a powerful, prevalent symbol, from Athena to, you bring up Whitley Strieber, saw the others as sort of owlish. I think John Keel and the Mothman, you could say they're kind of look like an owl. You bring up his work. So why is the owl such a powerful symbol?
It seems like some form of screening device. In ufology, screens are when somebody has been abducted, particularly when they're young, and the greys, for want of a better term, want to come off as not being so hostile and so dangerous. And because their facial features are very similar to an owl, they become projected as owls in the mind of the child or the youngster. But it seems that this owl symbolism goes right through history. And again, it could be something to do with the curiosity of owls. And one of the things that I found fascinating, and I didn't know this, was an owl can revolve its head almost all the way around. Why that is significant is maybe our alien friends can do this, maybe the entities can do this in some way, but the owl symbolism is intriguing. And had I had more space in the book, there was another book behind this book. There was so much material I couldn't use because I didn't have the space. And there was a whole section on owls and a whole section on totem figures and how people have totems, and the way in which in shamanic traveling you seek out your totem, you seek out your animal being when you're in alternate states of consciousness, and this being will help you develop. And of course, if anybody's been watching the recent remake or the recent TV production of His Dark Materials, in that you will see the Philip Pullman series. Philip Pullman, profoundly Gnostic writer. What does he have? Everybody has a daemon, and a daemon carries through their life. The daemon, before the corpus callosum gets solidified and before the myelination takes place, the daemon is many different creatures, and it changes from creature to creature until you reach adolescence, and then it simmers down and becomes one particular animal or another, like Pantaleimonium. Now, again, these are the arguments I use in my book, The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, way back, more than a decade ago now. Again, this is the idea that we have this entity within ourselves, and it talks to us and it relates to us. And it's when people's doors of perception are open that this entity can come through and can talk to us. And this is, again, some of the projects I'm going to be thinking of for my doctorate, is to how to find ways that we can help neurotypicals access the demonic within themselves.
Awesome. Yeah, we definitely need the means. And of course, in your book, you talk about certain means, DMT, how children are more sensitive to the imaginal of Corbin or the spirit world. And a question, sort of a fun exercise. And I have fantasized about this a bit, but imagine, Anthony, you're on stage and next to you is Richard Dawkins, and he's talking about goblins in the well, and it's all in our head. And you got Neil deGrasse Tyson saying, well, consciousness doesn't exist, and there is no God and all this. And suddenly the whoever's in this crowd of tens of thousands on NBC goes, well, Anthony, what would you say are the maybe 2 or 3 biggest arguments that what they're saying is not true, that there is a busy universe out there beyond time and space?
Okay, the first one I would do, by the way, that might be more of a reality than you think, because I have a friend of mine, Dr. David Parry, who is also a friend of Richard Dawkins. And one day when we were having coffee, he was turning around, he said, I must set up a meeting between you and my friend Richard. And I was going, oh yeah, fine, no, we'll do that one day. What does Richard do? And he said, he writes books. And I said, what about? He said, oh, the kind of stuff you're interested in. You might have heard of him, Richard Dawkins. And I went, oh yeah, I would love to. I'm a great admirer of Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, great work. Great work.
But sometimes he gets too carried away. I mean, I can agree with his problems with organized religion. I'm with him on that totally. But to go into denial about the other areas, I think is a dangerous one step too far. Now, in terms of what would I say to Richard Dawkins? Well, I'd say, please explain to me how it is that inanimate matter, that is atoms reacting with electrical fields, creates Richard Dawkins, his hopes, his fears, his anticipations, and everything else. Is it the addition of one molecule that suddenly makes Richard Dawkins manifest in his head? Is it 10 molecules? Is it a structure? Is it a single atom? Is it a single quark? Is it a group of quarks that suddenly changes from being inanimate to being something, and from them being something to being something that has an inner life? Now, Richard Dawkins, I assume, and obviously deGrasse's, are what are called eliminative materialists. Eliminative materialists are people that believe that there is no inner life, that we are fooling ourselves into thinking we are conscious. Famous examples of this are people like Daniel Dennett and the Churchlands. Now, my question to these guys is a simple one. How on earth can you be in denial of something that every single sentient consciousness on the planet knows is nonsense? You know, if you are saying that we are being fooled into believing we exist and we have an inner life, that by itself suggests that we have an inner life. I cannot fool a stone into thinking anything. I can only fool something if it's already reflecting on what I'm saying. God, you know, it's just brain numbing. How
Consciousness denying it's conscious.
Yeah,
That's what they're trying to
it's
do.
something conscious denying it's conscious. Now, again, it's not original to me. You know, in 1999, a young Australian philosopher by the name of David Chalmers stood up at a big conference, the consciousness conference at the University of Arizona, and said this, and said, there's the easy problem of science, which is how the brain works, how we map the brain. The hard problem of consciousness and science is how the brain creates consciousness itself. You know, that it creates, and it's a big issue here, because consciousness is not matter. Consciousness is, we all know that consciousness is not an epiphenomenon of brain behaviors. It's something qualitatively different. So then we fall into dualism, and then we get accused of Cartesian dualism, that there's two substances in the universe, there's thought and there's matter. No, there's not. It's matter that's the illusion. It's matter that's created by thought. It's matter that's created by consciousness. So there is a singularity, which is consciousness, and matter and mind come out of consciousness. When we start to understand that, we're then going to be in a position where we can move forward with our science, because there are too many mysteries within science at the moment for science to work effectively. But if we take our egregorial model, Richard Dawkins' world is just as real and just as tangible, because it's created out of Richard Dawkins' anticipations and Richard Dawkins' supporters. Just as James Randi's world is created in that way, just as my world is created in that way. But at least I'm in the position to actually reflect upon what I'm thinking of and what I'm thinking about. And at least I invest time in understanding where everybody's coming from. Only scientists only need one extraordinary experience to happen in their life, and suddenly it all changes. You know, Ibn Alexander III with his near-death experience, suddenly everything changed for him. And just as a final point on this, I do debates, and I have in the past debated with skeptics and everything else. Okay, I've done this before. I've done it on a few occasions. When we go out for a drink afterwards, the skeptics will turn around to me and they'll say, a lot of the points you made though were really quite good. But, you know, I just don't believe your position. You know, science is right and science can explain everything or whatever. And then they'll turn, and I wait. And after a pint or two, they'll turn around and one of them will go, but there was something that happened to me once I've never been able to explain. And then I listen to it and I attempt an explanation. And then I say, so why don't you talk about that in your books? Why don't you talk about that in your university lectures and everything else? And they say the same thing. If I did that, I'd be looking for a job. I need university tenure. If I say these things, I will lose my job. One final example of this. There is a British quantum physicist called Brian Josephson. Brian Josephson is the only living British Nobel Prize winner for physics, as far as I understand it. A few years ago, they were going to put stamps, and they were going to put Nobel Prize winning British scientists on the stamps. They didn't put Brian Josephson on the stamps because Brian Josephson is interested in researching telepathy. He is a Nobel Prize winner in physics for his invention of Josephson junctions, but he was denied being on a British stamp because he's interested in researching telepathy. This is not science, this is scientism. This is a religion that has its own doctrine, has its own belief systems. And if you don't follow the belief systems, you are ostracized and you are denigrated and you're not allowed to practice. This has got to change.
Well said, and I agree.
Neo-orthodoxy, right?
Yeah, I think someone said you should be on Joe Rogan. That's somebody you should approach
Joe
because
Rogan's not the least. Joe Rogan's not the least bit interested in me.
But he's had who's the
I know-
archaeologist you quote in your, I'm forgetting his name. I've written for his blog. He's been on Joe Rogan many times.
Oh, I know Joe Rogan. My
Rupert
Damon
Sheldrake
hypothesis
has been on. Yeah.
Yeah, my Damon hypothesis has been discussed by Joe Rogan.
Really?
I know 7 people that have written to Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan's producers on getting me on the show. They don't even get a response. Why? I don't know, but they don't even get a response. Not interested.
There's an egregore that likes
not
to suppress all this stuff, don't you think? I think
Well,
there's a
Joe
giant
Rogan,
egregore.
surely, he's interested in DMT. He's interested in all the things I discuss, but for some reason, he's not interested in me, so I'm not interested in him. So I don't want to be on his show. So even if he asked now, I wouldn't be on it.
Sounds like a plan. Well, as we get towards the end, Vance, any quick question for the audience before we wrap it up?
Let's see. I don't see one. I haven't been watching the chat very well. I'm afraid I've been listening too carefully.
How dare you enjoy yourself?
Oh, what?
Yeah. By the way, I have a saying that that I made up for these kind of people, which is, it's all in your head, including your head.
Oh, that's it. Graham Hancock has been on Joe Rogan many times, and he's pretty out there sometimes. So,
well, all I know is that Joe Rogan is not interested. The amount of times that people have contacted me on Facebook saying, "Oh, you've got to be on Joe Rogan." I'll contact him, and I always say to them, "You won't hear anything back." "Oh, yes, you will. He'll love it." And then they come back to me 2 weeks later, and I say, "Did you hear anything from Joe Rogan?" No. It's a mystery.
well.
It's a mystery. It's like one of the great mysteries of life, but it's one of those things.
What are you going to do?
Well, I said a second ago, I don't know if it got through, that I think there's a giant egregore that's out to suppress the truth about the underlying principles of reality.
Yeah, well, these universities, they create their own egregores. They have their own rules. As Anthony's saying, if you don't toe the party line, you're going to lose your funding, you're going to lose your job. And this is not just in all forms of sciences. It's a scary thing. That's why you've had an advantage, Anthony, because you're kind of going differently. You've already had this body of work, and now you're getting your doctorate. So you're kind of going the roundabout way.
But what's so important here, and it is so important, and it was something in one of my rants earlier on, science works. The scientific method works. The materialist reductionist model of understanding by breaking something down into its component parts works. The reason we're able to communicate here now works. And the fear is that if you start to chip away at that edifice, the whole thing will fall down. But of course it won't. It's just evolving. Thomas Kuhn, many years ago, 1970, I think it was, wrote a book called The Theory of Scientific Revolutions. The idea that science evolves within itself. There are seeds within the previous paradigm that carries through. But what happens is there are things that cannot be explained by this paradigm. And it's within those things we cannot explain that the new paradigm grows. But I'm not denigrating science. But the thing is, with, say, materialist reductionism, for instance, it doesn't work with consciousness. You can reduce the brain down to its constituent parts as much as you like, but you'll never discover consciousness. It just doesn't work. It's like taking a radio apart to find the studio. It's like taking your computer apart now to try and find Miguel, Anthony, and Vance inside the computer. You're not going to find it there. And that's quite a good analogy, that one, isn't it? It's quite good.
It appears in the movie Zoolander, if anybody's watched it.
Does it? Oh, right. Okay,
go ahead.
They'll sue me now. But science is important. And that's why I always take the scientific approach. I go from science to the extraordinary. And I make that leap. But there are other people who then just stay in the wacky world and just make all these wacky ideas, and they get books published, they get interviewed, and everybody thinks they're brilliant and everything else, but it's not based on anything, And for me, I'd probably, as I've said many times, if I said I was channeling all this from the planet Tharg, and that I had a 70,000-year-old Atlantean master behind me who was telling me all these things, I'd be a millionaire. I'd be on all
rich.
And they'd love me. I don't. I'm just an ordinary guy from Liverpool and a Scouser, and I'm a working class kid, and I just don't do that kind of crap,
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up here. Again, let me remind everybody first, thank you, those in the chat room. Great questions. This will be out on YouTube soon after. And of course, it will be out on all our podcast channels in a day. I will add our first few episodes of Schrodinger's Diary, where Anthony Peake and I explore much more about this. And it's an amazing context. So of course, please support, please get Anthony's book. It's a great read. I know these are tough times for everybody in different ways, mentally, socially, and financially. If anything, just share our work, bang the drum if you can. Let's get this alternative spirituality out, because I think it's more than ever in this very changing world where all our old paradigms are dying with everything that's going on. So, and Anthony, for those who do not know where they can find out more about your work.
Yeah, that's fine. I have a website, anthonypeake.com. I'm very, very active on Facebook, which you'll find me as Anthony Peake. And also I'm developing now, I've only comparatively recently started on Instagram. And I post normally 2 or 3 times a day on Instagram now. And that is Cheat the Ferryman 54. So Cheat the Ferryman 54. Please join me over there. Please join in. I'm at my 5,000 friends on Facebook, but people drop off and I add people as I can. But you can still become a follower, which gives you all the access and everything else as well. And there's around about 5,000 followers there as well. Please join in. The thing about what I'm trying to do and what my friends are trying to do and what my associates are trying to do is we're open to ideas. We're not preaching a particular worldview. All we want is answers to the big questions. And if that means taking us down all kinds of routes of Borges's Garden of the Forking Paths, another great person that we did a show on.
Yeah.
And Borges was, of course, a Gnostic. And if you ever want to read Gnostic belief systems in a fictional format, 2 writers, Borges and Philip K. Dick.
Of course. Yeah, right on. And your consciousness hours, I listened to it through Facebook, like you had last time with your guest Jade, which was amazing because you get these guests that give these case studies and what they're doing. Do you stream it only through Facebook or other places?
Yeah, what I'm doing at the moment is we're streaming it through. What we do is I just film the interview as it takes place and put that on Facebook Live. And that happens the second Sunday every month. And that's a live show. And I've got guests planned for the rest of the year. And we've got some fantastic people coming up, plus the background of all the previous shows. But what I'm also doing is I'm going through my back catalogue for the earliest shows. And Miguel will be one of them. Miguel was, I think, guest twice, I think, on it. And what I'm doing is I'm broadcasting the shows on Facebook Live, the recordings, and I'm joined on the recording by the guest so that people can ask questions of the guest while they watch the show. But what I will also do is post the link to the YouTube show about 4 or 5 days before. So if anybody wants to be ahead of the game and wants to have already watched it so they can ask specific questions, that's what we're doing. And that seems to work very, very well. I'm also considering having some previous guests back, literally to just do something like this and have people ask questions of them as well. There's so much there. And it's like, this is all like a huge Venn diagram. There's so much there, but in the middle is this truth. The gnosis is in there, and that's where the gnosis can be found. And we're gonna break it. We're gonna crack through. And it's going to happen. It may not happen next week. It may not happen next month. But with your guys' help and your input and everything else, we can make this happen. I'm not a cult leader. I'm not anything. I'm just an ordinary guy. And people who know this know this. I'm just an ordinary person. And I've been fortunate enough to be in the position I'm in. But we're all working together on this. We're all working together towards something really, really exciting. So join it. The water's warm. We're having a lot of great fun. And everything else. So just please, and thank you for listening in. It's much appreciated on this lockdown Friday. But enjoy the rest of the weekend, guys.
In prison. Well, thank you. Well, Vance, thanks for keeping us company and the great questions too.
Oh, you don't have to thank me. This is delightful. Anthony, it's so great to be here with you. And Miguel, thanks for giving me that opportunity.
Awesome. Well, Anthony, as always, it's been an honor and a pleasure, and we shall continue talking. And please, audience, get his book. It's a great book. And this cat is scratching my scratching my crotch. I'm gonna die while I'm trying to talk.
That's got to be one of the best lines ever. This cat is scratching my scrotum. I think what you could do with that is you could call your new show that. I think it's the arc. It's definitely your daemon here, deciding on your new title.
Or a little archon. I don't know which. We'll have a talk after this interview. All right. Well, thank you, Anthony, and thanks to everybody who joined. Really appreciate it, and it was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.